Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guests today are Meg Lundsager. Meg is a former U.S. Executive Director and alternate Executive Director of the International Monetary Fund, and also a Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow. Bruce Jentleson is a Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow and the William Preston Few Distinguished Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Political Science at Duke University. They join us today to talk about sanctions against Russia in the wake of its invasion of Ukraine. Bruce and Meg, great to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Good to be with you, John.
So Meg, I thought this is dangerous, as from a guy who is a math idiot, but I thought I would begin by asking you for a bit of Sanctions 101. We talk about these things as if everyone knows what we're talking about and how they work. Could you give us a brief primer on what are the different kinds of sanctions and what is the intention of what can they do? What can they achieve?
Well, in the old days, John, it was mostly like trade sanctions. So it would be an embargo on Cuba, for instance, that sort of thing. But I'd say in the last 20 years or so, the reliance and the impact of financial sanctions has grown tremendously. And the US has been at the forefront of that. So we have found that they've been a good way to send a foreign policy signal of how serious something is, the actions of another country, without involving the engagement of US military forces, which you've heard the president talk about a number of times. So financial sanctions can take many different forms. One of the favorite ones is to sanction individual people. So the Treasury Department will say, these 5 people who are involved in the drug trade in Colombia can no longer access their bank accounts in the US. Or, terrorist finance, going after terrorists. The kind of sanctions that we're imposing on Russia started initially last week with basically hitting a couple of banks and saying we're going to look at some of the leading officials. And then over the weekend, all of a sudden, they escalated tremendously. So the sanctions that are in place now are really much more significant than were planned or intended even a week ago. And I think it has to do with brutality, the extensiveness of the attack on Ukraine and the Europeans coming around. And we can talk a little bit more about, some of the details of these sanctions, if you like.
Okay, thank you. And we will. I'll take you up on that offer. But Bruce, let me first ask you just about the use of sanctions in a context like this. And when we say like this, right, we're talking about something that hasn't happened on this scale since perhaps World War II. But when you're talking about nuclear powers, are sanctions really the only response available without risking nuclear war?
Yeah, well, I think right now we have not made them the only response. I think the Biden administration, has done a lot with them. Its rhetoric before the sanctions were imposed was using language like crippling, devastating. I'm not convinced they're very significant and severe. I'm not convinced they're like that. What we've been doing is using them in combination with a couple of other elements. One is diplomacy. It's amazing. I mean, there was a vote at the United Nations the other day, 141-5 in the General Assembly, censuring Russia for this. It's hard, to say the least, to get that kind of vote in the UN. And the scope of support, Switzerland, which is traditionally neutral, is cooperating with financial sanctions that Meg was talking about. Singapore, which has never before cooperated with sanctions not authorized by the UN, is cooperating. So there's a credibility message there too to the Russians that the world really, it's not just the US and its allies. At the same time, we and many other countries are providing military assistance to the Ukrainian military and opposition. So there is a military element here. It's not direct US-Russian confrontation. It's worth remembering that we have tried to avoid that ever since the nuclear age started, when Soviet Union invaded Hungary in 1956. No military response. When they invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, no military response. One of the reasons for not going further into Syria, among others, was concern about clashing with the Russian military. So sanctions are a part of an overall strategy. They're a significant element, but we're not putting it all on the back of sanctions.
Thanks. Meg, first comes the threat of sanctions, right? With the hopes that that would prevent the behavior. Didn't work. Putin invaded. Was that a miscalculation on his part about the severity of the sanctions, or was it essentially a message of I don't care, go ahead, sanction away?
I think with Putin, it was the latter, I don't care, go ahead and sanction away. With that said, I don't think he expected the severity of the sanctions that have been imposed. I don't think he thought that they'd be cut off from the SWIFT system, which is a telecommunication system that banks use to facilitate their financial transactions. And there was this extreme sanction of actually the Western countries freezing the assets of the central bank. They had built up, the Russian central bank, a huge pile of foreign exchange reserves, which was viewed, the Russians viewed as their protection against any actions by the West, because the only countries that we've done that sort of a severe sanction on have been countries like North Korea, Iran, not a larger country like Russia. It's still not a huge country in terms of the global economy, but it is a G20 country. It is 12% of global GDP and a big energy supplier. So I don't think they expected that we would then freeze these assets. Also the sovereign wealth fund, their, what do they call it, national investment fund. So in doing that, we've really limited their access to foreign exchange. With that said, it's obviously not turning things around. I mean, the troops aren't withdrawing. So I don't think the threat of sanctions or even the imposition of sanctions are really going to deter Putin. I don't know what will, frankly. It's a bit of a mystery to me. And I think there's a lot of puzzlement out there in terms of what will it take. But the severity of the sanctions will impact the Russian people, Russian companies, and will have an impact on the rest of the world as well. And I don't know that we're all prepared for that yet.
Bruce, along those lines, obviously not a quick fix. How does this play out now? How much can Russia endure?
Well, there are a lot of cases. One of the things about sanctions, when they've been used in a lot of different cases, is you often get high economic impact, but low policy effect. Look at North Korea, pretty high economic impact. If anything, they've continued to build further their nuclear program. We can come back to Iran because you get a difference between the Obama policy and the Trump policy. The Trump policy had more economic impact, but less policy effect. Whereas the Obama program had significant economic impact, got cooperation from the UN and from allies, but linked it to a diplomatic option that, requires some concessions on Iran, but not saying uncle, right? So ultimately, this is going to have to lead towards some diplomacy, whether it's with Putin or whether some Russians decide he's no longer in their interests. It brings pressure, but it's not going to get him to say uncle. And it could, as we've seen, his threats to escalate to the nuclear level, it could lead him in the other direction, precisely because they're having economic impact. So you have to convert that economic impact into policy effect, and it doesn't just flow from high economic impact.
Chris, you just said something that demands a follow-up. If it's not Putin, what is the likelihood that this could be Putin's Waterloo?
So I'm not going to put any likelihood on it, but I think people sometimes overstate how protected he or any authoritarian ruler is, right? And it's worth remembering that Khrushchev was removed in 1964 in significant part because of the way, in their view, he mishandled the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not so much conceding, but getting in that situation in the first place. It's worth remembering that Gorbachev was removed from power in 1991 and that Yeltsin was removed from power in 1999. Authoritarian regimes have ways of changing leaders. And if you look at the facial expressions of some of his team, the intelligence chief, his defense chief, when they're sitting, it's one thing to have Macron at the end of a 20-foot table, but your own key people. And, it's something we won't know about till, if and when it happens, and I'm not betting John my next mortgage payment on it. But, part of the goal here is for Russian nationalists, not so much people that say, I want to, I like the West, don't see, Russian nationalists to calculate that while they may still care about Ukraine and they may still oppose Ukraine going into NATO, this Putin strategy for trying to achieve this is really not in Russian interest. It's not in Russian pride. So it's not so much the streets as, whether or not any of that happens. And I just want us to have that out there as not eliminating that, not banking on it.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. Meg, we were talking about this in terms now, sanctions didn't prevent the invasion. So now we're in a longer term strategy. And you just mentioned that the world may not be prepared for the implications or the sacrifices to come. Can you expand on that a bit? Are we talking about something that could go on for years? And what will be the implications for the global economy?
Yeah, first of all, just to follow up on the sanctions question, once you impose sanctions, it's just not so easy to take them off. And we've seen this time and time again, especially in the US, if it's something that Congress has voted on, it's part of US law. Because I was an implementer of sanctions when I was at the IMF, and things that were totally contrary to really what was US policy, well, took an act of Congress to change. So that's one problem. That's why the sanctions will be there for a while. But in the meantime, the sanctions are already escalating global prices. I mean, we saw even before the invasion, oil prices were going up. We're all suffering higher inflation in the US, Europe, the rest of the world. And so now prices are really feeling the impact. Oil prices, natural gas in Europe is sky high, really hurting a lot of people. Global interest rates are going to be going up. Chairman Powell said today and yesterday in congressional testimony that he supports an interest rate increase this month, and there'll be more to come this year because of the high US inflation. So we're all going to be feeling this. This is all coming together at the same time. We had high inflation for all sorts of reasons, and now we're getting the supply shock on the oil side. And the sanctions are having the effect of chilling trade even where it's allowed. So you're seeing refiners not wanting to buy Russian oil, even though that's allowed under the sanctions. Insurance companies don't want to insure freight. Shipping companies don't want to line up. So it is having that impact, and all that is going to raise costs of production. Wheat prices are up. We're already seeing China buying corn and soybeans from the US. So you're seeing people starting to stockpile. I don't want to say panic buying, but they are preparing for shortages, increased difficulties in trade. So all this is going to play out over the coming months, if not years, and make policymaking extremely difficult for the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, other central banks, as well as all our fiscal authorities around the world. And this inflation is going to be difficult to wind down.
Bruce, the solidarity we've seen, you mentioned the 140 votes in the UN. Meg just talked about corporations stepping forward and making decisions independent of any mandates or laws that make that required. Are you surprised by the level of solidarity we've seen? And maybe more importantly, do you think Vladimir Putin has been surprised by the level of solidarity?
Very much so. I think in the run-up that Meg was talking about, the deterrent effort at sanctions, there was some cooperation coming from the Europeans, but a degree of reluctance. I mean, after all, they have 9 times as much trade with Russia as we do. And then the energy interdependence is there in terms of oil and natural gas, which, by the way, one of the reasons they turned to that more was to, get away from the Middle East, which is not exactly a stable supplier, or at least reduce dependence on them. And I think what we've seen, with this invasion, it is so, whatever the negative version of iconic is, right? It's interstate war, which, by the way, the UN has been better at than intrastate wars. When North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, when Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990, not Iraq 2003, and it's right there in Europe. And you have 1 million refugees already. And so it's been funny. Some people have been saying, oh, the Europeans are ahead of the Americans. Well, they have more interests at stake, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I think the shift we saw, and John, you sent around a wonderful article from Axios to all of us listing all of the companies that are reacting to this. You know, oil companies, BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, a number of other companies. And if you contrast that with the way corporations are about the efforts to sanction China over the Uyghurs' human rights, where Intel was highly criticized for sort of sending a letter of apology they wrote, and the Swedish retailer H&M has been trying to risk that. You know, it's a very striking difference that Putin could not have seen coming. And the sports sanctions. And with South Africa in the 1980s, while it was economic, one of the things that really bothered the average Afrikaner in the street was being, you know, cut out of world rugby and world cricket. And so we're having, you know, it in soccer, football, and we're having it in so many sports. And the message this sends of, you know, isolation, and when the whole world is sending us a message, even people you didn't think would do it, sports associations, companies.
Movies.
You know, movies, yeah. Putin may be doing something wrong. And again, you have to counterattack that from a Russian nationalist point of view, not just a dissident point of view, if it's going to have credibility in the Russian culture.
Yeah, I saw an interview with a man on the street in Moscow talking about how unhappy he is with the ability to get his new iPhone as a result of things that are happening. So this is going to go down to that level of discontent. Meg, about this notion of this amazing solidarity we've seen globally, even in voluntary cases, as Bruce and you were just discussing, are there countries that are most vulnerable to losing their resolve because of their, say, dependence on Russian oil or whatever the case might be?
That's a good question, John, and it's hard to predict that. I think we've seen just incredible solidarity in the part of European countries in terms of welcoming refugees, which in the past they have not done. And in terms of the German commitments to increase military defense spending, to send more weaponry to Ukraine. I mean, we're seeing just sort of a dramatic increase. And I think it's a wake-up call to a changed world that we're in now. With that said, over time, as it really begins to hurt ordinary citizens around the world, then it gets harder. I think in Europe, the resolve is there and they will persist. And if the US can help by replacing some of the gas sales, of course, Germany doesn't have an LNG terminal, but you know, Netherlands does, others do. So it will be very difficult, and it'll be politically difficult. As you know, these countries, especially for instance in Italy, you know, constant elections, difficult for the governments to hold together public support for the policies. So it will be a real challenge. And then, as I noted earlier, it just puts the central bank in a bind and how they react and the impact that has on ordinary citizens. So you may see a bit of fraying. In terms of a major departure, I think it really depends on how bad do things get in Ukraine. I mean, ultimately, if Russia occupies, takes over Ukraine, and we end up sanctioning Ukraine, right, because now it's de facto part of Russia again, I think Europe will be still pretty united because it's so much closer physically to them. But you know, we'll have to see how it might unfold and what kind of modifications or approaches or other cooperative measures we can develop amongst ourselves. For instance, OPEC hasn't committed to an increase in production yet. I mean, there's a small increase coming that was already planned, but they're holding back a bit. So can we persuade OPEC to produce more oil? And at the same time, what does that do to our green energy agenda? I mean, here we are.
And U.S.-Saudi relations are not exactly at a high point.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, you know, in terms of being able, you know, can we increase fracking? Mexico's, you know, production has been declining. How do we, you know, manage our energy transition, our energy supplies? How much are we willing to share with Europe? What's going to be the impact in the United States? We have important elections here later this year in the fall. And so our administration is going to be very cautious about the kinds of things that might make life a little more difficult for American citizens. So you see already the discussion, you know, let's release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, maybe eliminate, you know, temporarily lift the gasoline excise tax, which of course then will be hard to reimpose at some point. So I do think on the solidarity side, it really depends, I think, a lot on the US helping European partners to maintain their resolve. And
Weather
we'll
the storm.
see if we can bear the cost of that.
Mhm. Bruce, on the biggest level, you and I have known each other for decades, and I followed your work, and we've had occasion to discuss things about, say, the post-Cold War era, and defining that. How do you view this now? Have you had a chance to process it? How significant is this on that big question of how the world is organized, how nations interact? Is this a redefining moment, a bump in the road? How do you view it?
So, John, I still remember June 1990, we went over to Berlin together for C-SPAN and talked to high school students from West and East Berlin.
Right after the fall of the wall.
It was fascinating. Yeah, I have to tell you, I'm seeing a lot and hearing a lot of Ukraine changed everything, and I do not. It can, if it escalates, if it spreads to NATO countries, and we have the equivalent of a world war, or clearly if it escalates to the nuclear level. But it didn't change everything. The climate. I mean, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out with a report this week, about the rapidly closing window. 400,000 people died around the world from climate change in 2018, and that's going to increase by 400% by 2035. The next pandemic is not if, but when. There are issues with U.S.-China, how to manage that relationship. So it did not change everything. I think it in some ways took us back to 1949 when NATO was formed for its original raison d'etre, and added that. And I think, the question of European security going forward, I mean, if this crisis gets reduced and resolved, what Meg was saying before, part of the reason the Biden administration has opposed a bill in Congress that has Republican and Democratic support to impose sanctions is because you need to keep them in executive discretion. And this question of, the two-step of what you lift, when you do, in exchange for what concession, it's been an issue with North Korea. It's been an issue with Iran. I do think that if we get to a point where Russia is, willing and forced to withdraw, and the Europeans, I think at that point, just like before the invasion, will really believe it's in their interest to try to ratchet that down. And there, I think it's not just keeping the resolve up, but we may learn something from them. If we go too hard line on this, it could be counterproductive. So, it's a huge issue, but the rest of the global agenda just hasn't gone away. And so it's changed a lot, but it did not change everything, no matter how much we're focusing on it, in our current discourse.
Meg, I want to ask you, similar to Bruce's analysis of the geopolitical structure of the world, if there is such a thing, right? Sometimes it appears to be chaos. On the global economy, focusing on the economy itself, and if Russia continues to remain isolated or becomes increasingly isolated as a result of its actions and the sanctions in response to those actions, what does the global economy look like moving forward? How does China play into this? They've been very cautious in their selection of language in almost supporting Russia, but not fully supporting Russia. It doesn't seem to be in their long-term interests to be aligned with a country that is becoming an economic pariah when, through Belt and Road and other initiatives, they have very different goals. How does the global economy look moving forward if Russia's role is greatly diminished?
I think the global economy will look much more fragmented and much more, secure trading relations that we feel totally comfortable with. We've already seen a big effort, just because of the supply chain disruptions we've seen during the pandemic. And it's gone so far as you heard the president the other night in the State of the Union talk about Buy American. So, of course, that won't work in the U.S. economy because we're so dependent on many imported inputs and consumer goods especially. So it'll be very difficult to bring all that production back to the United States. Of course, we have the USMCA, U.S., Canada, Mexico trade agreement, freight trade agreement. We should use more effectively the three countries. But of course, then we had supply chain disruptions on the Canadian side with the truckers blocking the key bridges. between our two countries. So all this has just reinforced the need to bring critical production back to the home country. So it's not just the US, other countries, you're going to see Europe acting this way. And so that's going to add to increased costs. I do believe we're going to see deeper relations between Russia and China on the economic side. China will by far be the dominant partner there. And I don't think the Chinese have a whole lot of respect for the Russians, to be quite honest, in terms of what they've achieved in their economy compared to what China has achieved. Of course, China's done that by becoming much more dependent on global markets for its exports, for its growth, for its job creation, which Russia hasn't. And the energy sector hasn't exactly been a big job creator in Russia. So, but I do think we're going to see more interdependence there. China, I think in the long run, is going to try and push the broader usage of its payment system that it has domestically, and countries are already using that, those that trade in China, but that's settlements in RMB and yuan, the Chinese currency. And because Chinese financial markets are closed and they make frequent use of exchange controls to limit inflows and outflows, there's just no chance that the Chinese financial sector can play the role that the US financial sector does. So I do think we're going to see disrupted trade, real problems in terms of moving goods and supplies around the world. Financially, I think the US is still going to be the dominant economy and the dollar, the dominant currency. But how all that sort of comes together and what the unanticipated, unforeseen developments are going to be, the shortages that are going to pop up here or there, or the difficulties in doing business one way or another, we don't know. There's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty out there. And when you hear the Federal Reserve Chair talk about a lot of uncertainty, how are they supposed to plan their policy going forward? And, policy ends up looking at data that's in the past and making their best guess for the future. And right now, that future is very hard to predict.
Murky picture. Bruce, before we close, I wanted to ask you to let our viewers know about the new book that you'll have hitting shelves soon.
So I've been writing a book on sanctions, and it'll be out in a few months from Oxford University Press. The original intent of the book was I've worked on sanctions when I've served in the Obama State Department and way back on the Tiananmen Square, sanctions when I was in the Clinton State Department, the Bill Clinton State Department, and I've written on this as a scholar in a variety of things. And so I said, about a year ago, sanctions are being used a lot. Some people call them the Swiss Army knife of foreign policy, to write a book. Little did we know we'd have such a big case. And, in some respects, we'd have a lot of sales if the book was out now, but it wouldn't have talked about the Russia case. So we're adding that, and we hope to have it, available to people through Oxford Press in a couple months. Thank you.
Life is what happens when we're making other plans, right? And it affects everything. Bruce, thank you. Meg, thank you as well. This has been a terrific discussion. Your big picture insights are really critical and worthwhile at a time when it's hard to not get lost in the weeds when we see the horrific images coming from Ukraine. So thank you for your helping us sort it out on the highest levels.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon for another. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for being here.